So next, I'd like to introduce Gabriel Rockhill. Gabriel is a philosopher, cultural critic, and activist. He's the founding director of the Critical Theory Workshop and professor of philosophy at Villanova University. He's published 9 books, numerous scholarly and journaling articles, and including most recently, Counter History of the Present. And for more information, you can follow his website as gabrielrockhill.com. Gabriel's talk today is titled Anti-Communism and Western Marxism, the Case of the Frankfurt School. Gabriel will examine the historical relationship between one of the hottest commodities of the global theory industry that presents itself as Marxist, namely the Frankfurt School, and actually existing socialism. By critically juxtaposing the works of figures like Adorno and Horkheimer to the Eastern Marxism manifest in the orientation of the Third International, Gabriel will situate the Frankfurt School's overt anti-communism more broadly within the international world war of ideas and the political economy undergirding it. Please welcome Gabriel.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It's a real honor to collaborate with so many powerhouse intellectuals and important theoretical and practical organizations, and I hope we'll have other opportunities to collaborate. My comments today will not be focused so much on capital per se, as on what Lenin referred to as the revolutionary core of Marxism, which of course is found in Capital, but also other works by Marx and Engels. And also then what became of this revolutionary core in what's referred to as Western or cultural Marxism. It's part of a larger research project entitled The Intellectual World War, the failed attempt to kill the very idea of communism. So the Frankfurt School and Frankfurt School critical theory has been, along with French theory, one of the hottest commodities of the global theory industry. Together, they serve as the common source of so many of the trend-setting, globalized forms of theoretical critique that currently dominate the world market. The Frankfurt School's political orientation has therefore had a foundational effect on the Western intelligentsia and is situated at the very core of Western or cultural Marxism. What I would like to do here very briefly is recontextualize the Frankfurt School's work in relationship to the international class struggle, and in particular, the attempt, in the words of Cold Warrior CIA agent Thomas Braden, to redefine the left as the compatible, meaning non-communist left. Notably through the use of foundation money and the Central Intelligence Agency front groups such as the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which published Adorno in their journals and hosted Horkheimer at their conferences. Within this context, as we will see briefly, these two critical theorists, while offering some significant critiques of consumer society and the culture industry, were ultimately playing the role of radical recuperators. Cultivating an appearance of radicality, they recuperated the very activity of critique within a pro-Western, anti-communist ideology. Not unlike other members of the petty bourgeois intelligentsia in Europe, which formed the basis of Western Marxism, they were disgusted by the savage barbarians in the East who dared to take up the weapon of Marxist theory a la Lenin and use it to act on the principle that they could rule themselves. From the relative comforts of their professorial citadels in the West, financially supported by capitalist foundations and imperialist states, they defended the superiority of the Euro-American world that promoted them against the leveling project of the Bolshevized barbarians in the uncivilized periphery. My talk is going to kind of just jump through a few highlights in order to respect the time, so bear with me. So when Horkheimer took over the directorship of the Institute for Social Research in 1930, his stewardship was characterized by speculative concerns with culture and authority rather than rigorous historical materialist analyses of capitalism, class struggle, and imperialism. He refused and had taken a very specific position regarding the Institute to engage with direct political issues. This refusal intensified when the Institute moved to the United States in the early 30s. The Institute adapted itself to the local bourgeois order, censoring its own past and present work to suit local academic and corporate susceptibilities. Horkheimer literally had words like Marxism, revolution, and communism expunged from its publications in order to avoid offending its American sponsors. Furthermore, any type of political activity was forbidden. Horkheimer instead put his energy into securing corporate and state funding for the Institute, which he did very successfully, and he even hired a public relations firm to promote its work in the United States. Amongst the elements that are operative behind the support of the Frankfurt School, it is important to recognize that they decided after their sojourn in the United States to move back not to East Germany, but to West Germany. And in order to do that, they entered into one of the epicenters of the global class war against communism and received ample funding from the Rockefeller Foundation in particular in order to be at the forefront of this cultural war against actually existing socialism. Horkheimer continued his censorship of the Institute's work, refusing to publish 2 articles by no less than Jürgen Habermas because they were critical of liberal democracy and spoke of revolution, daring to suggest the possibility of an emancipation from, quote, the shackles of bourgeois society, end quote. In his private correspondence, Horkheimer candidly submitted to an apparently sympathetic Adorno that, quote, it is simply not possible to have admissions of this sort in the research report of an institute that exists on the public funds of this shackling society, end quote. This appears to be a forthright admission that the economic base of the Frankfurt School was the driving force behind its ideology, or at least its public discourse. It is important to recall in this regard that 5 of the 8 members of the Horkheimer Circle had been employed by the US government and national security state, which had a vested interest in the continuing loyalty of the Frankfurt School because a number of its members were working on sensitive government projects. Adorno, after all, was brought to the United States originally to work on Paul Lazarsfeld's Office of Radio Research project, which received funding from the Rockefeller Foundation and worked very closely with the US national security state. In fact, 75% of its annual budget was made up of government money. The Rockefeller Foundation also funded Horkheimer's first return to Germany in 1948. And we should not forget that the Rockefellers are one of the greatest gangster families in the history of US capitalism, and they use their foundation as a tax shelter that allows them to mobilize a portion of their stolen wealth in the corruption of intellectual activity and culture. So with all of these ties to the capitalist ruling class in Western states, it should no wise surprise us that the US government supported the Frankfurt School's move back to West Germany with a very significant grant that amounts to over $1 million in 2022 dollars. The Institute also received support from private donors, the Society of Social Research, the City of Frankfurt, and it even signed a research contract with the Mannesmann Corporation that had been a founding member of the Anti-Bolshevik League and had financed the Nazi Party. One of the elements of the research that they did for this Nazi collaborating company was a sociological study of workers' opinions, with the implicit implication that such a study would help management stall or prevent socialist organizing. Shepard Stone, I think, most clearly identified the role that the Frankfurt School played for the corporatocracy in the US national security state. He was a director of international affairs for the Ford Foundation, where he oversaw their close work with the Central Intelligence Agency on numerous cultural and intellectual projects. And he sent a personal note to the State Department in the 1940s to encourage them to extend Adorno's passport, where he said the Institute for Frankfurt is helping to train German leaders who will know something of democratic techniques. I believe it is important for our overall democratic objectives in Germany that such men as Professor Adorno have an opportunity to work in that country, end quote. The Institute was doing the kind of ideological work that the US state and capitalist ruling class wanted and did support. Meeting and even surpassing the dictates of ideological conformity of the shackling society that funded the Institute, Horkheimer openly expressed his fulsome support for the US anti-imperialist puppet government in West Germany, anti-communist puppet government in West Germany, whose intelligence services had been stocked with former Nazis, as well as its imperial project in Vietnam. Horkheimer is on record as claiming, quote, in America, when it is necessary to conduct a war, and now listen to me, it is not so much a question of the defense of the homeland, but it is essentially a matter of the defense of the Constitution, the defense of the rights of man, end quote. Now, Adorno occasionally shirked in the political shadows, but in 1956, he supported, along with Horkheimer, the imperialist invasion of Egypt by Israel, Britain, and France, which aimed at seizing the Suez Canal and overthrowing Nasser. They referred to Nasser as a, quote, fascist chieftain who conspires with Moscow, and exclaimed, quote, no one even ventures to point out that these Arab robber states have been on the lookout for years for an opportunity to fall upon Israel and to slaughter the Jews who have found refuge there, end quote. So according to this pseudo-dialectical inversion, it is the Arab robber states, not the settler colony working with poor imperialist countries, that is fascist. Now, Adorno and Horkheimer published one of their most overt political texts the same year in '56. Rather than supporting the global movement for anti-colonial liberation and the building of a socialist world, they celebrate, with only a few minor exceptions, the superiority of the Western world while repeatedly disparaging the Soviet Union and China. Invoking stock racist descriptions of the barbarians in the East, these are their words, whom they describe as fascists who have chosen slavery. Adorno even chastises Germans who mistakenly think that, quote, the Russians stand for socialism, reminding them that the Russians are actually fascists, adding that the industrialists and bankers already know this, undoubtedly due to the threat posed by communism to their property interests. I believe, Horkheimer averred in a world historical conclusion that provoked no rebuttal on the part of his closest collaborator, that Europe and America are probably the best civilizations that history has produced up to now as far as prosperity and justice are concerned. The key point now is to ensure the preservation of these gains. Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, also supported quite resolutely the quote-unquote totalitarian equivalence between fascism and communism. If this equivalence manifests itself in socialist state-building projects, anti-colonial movements, or even new left mobilizations in the Western world. In all three cases, those who think they are breaking out of the shackling society of bourgeois society are only making things worse, according to Adorno and Horkheimer. Our philosophy, they write, and here I'm arriving soon at my conclusion, as a dialectical critique of the overall social tendency of the age, stands in the sharpest opposition to the politics and doctrine that emanates from the Soviet Union. We are unable to see anything in the practice of the military dictatorships disguised as people's democracies other than a new form of repression. Adorno doubled down on this and also added China as a reference point and said that he would have to go back on everything he's ever thought if he were to support anything that he sees in China, and hence by extension in these Eastern Marxist movements that were changing the world, not simply interpreting it. So a final conclusion is the following. So the goal of this very brief analysis, which is part of a larger project, is not simply to demonstrate that Adorno and Horkheimer were on the wrong side of history, defending capitalist countries and their imperialist endeavors over and against the socialist world. It is rather to situate their work within the political economy of ideas by elucidating the relationship between their research and the intellectual apparatus that structured it. By intellectual apparatus, I mean the material system of production, circulation, and reception that forms an important part of the superstructure. As we have seen, they were amply funded and supported by the capitalist ruling class and imperialist states, including the Central Intelligence Agency of the US National Security State, which provided them with comfortable lifestyles and promoted their research as the most radical work on offer, precisely because they rejected as beyond the pale actually existing socialism and the entire tradition of revolutionary socialism. Far from being Marxists in the anti-revisionist sense, they were radical recuperators within the capitalist intellectual apparatus. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.